Welcome to our open book. Very good to be with you. Hi there, Mr. Wood, Dorothy Joy, Sarah O'Brien, Marianne, Joan Denny, John O'Hara, Tom Hanline, Mr. Dickens. Very good to see you. Thank you, everybody. Marianne Baumgartner, Jeremy Sicking, Linda Caroline, Karen Smith. Look, we have so enjoyed this book and The Aviator and the Showman. And we are glad to be able to welcome our now friend Laurie Gwen Shapiro, who we met at the Carl Sandburg Awards, where she was a New York author impersonating as a Chicago author. Doing, yeah. But some of us weren't thrown. In any event, this is just a wonderful book and a story I certainly didn't know, and which bears a lot of telling about the great Amelia Earhart and her relationship with her husband, George Putnam. So, how they helped each other and didn't. So, in any event, Laurie Gwen Shapiro joins us. Thanks so much for being with us, Laurie.
I'm very excited. And as you said, I met you online in Chicago. You never know who you're standing next to online.
Oh, in the line. Yeah, not online. No, we were
the Chicago Book Awards.
Yeah, about to be introduced, as a matter of fact.
That's right.
They uttered my name and people were going, who? And then they mentioned your name and people were going, she's from New York. Don't hit us. Amazing.
Well, the reason I was there, to be honest, a lot of people don't know, is that this is a book about Amelia Earhart's life. And she graduated from high school from Chicago. She went to 7 different high schools. And people didn't know who she was when she was in high school, but they certainly knew who she was in 1928 when she was the first passenger. She went back to school and she stood on her piano and there was a mob scene. She was one of the first people to incite a mob scene.
That's what. Tell us about Amelia Earhart when she met George Putnam.
Okay. So I like to say that Amelia Earhart was the first reality show contestant. She does not become famous. A lot of people know that she disappeared in 1937. During her lifetime, she was most famous for crossing the Atlantic alone in 1932. But she actually became famous for the first time in 1928. And she was a passenger, not flying across the Atlantic. What had happened is in 1927, Charles Lindbergh had crossed the Atlantic alone, and the man who would become his publisher was George Palmer Putnam, and he was also the publisher to Richard Byrd, Admiral Richard Byrd. And, nobody's going to buy a book about the second guy across the Atlantic. That's not going to sell copies at Christmas. And there was an opportunity for a woman who was talked out of being a passenger, a very wealthy woman named Amy Phipps Guest. Her kids said, Mom, you're not going to be going crossing the Atlantic. That's not happening. And they talked her into sponsoring a young woman to represent America, to be the first woman to cross. And Putnam got wind of it because Byrd was his client. She was leasing a plane for Byrd, and he saw an in to have a book that no one else had the scoop on and kept her very secret. And in June of 28, it was May they met, but in June of 28, she is revealed to the world as Lady Lindy. And she's been modeled to look exactly like Lindy. Her hair is cut to look like Lindbergh. That haircut was not her haircut that she had. But prior to that, she had more of a bob. And she was basically fashioned to be famous. And she was terribly embarrassed by this because she did become famous. She came back. She had a ticker tape parade in New York. She had a big parade in Boston and one in Chicago. And she felt like she never did the work. She never was behind the plane. And it was there she decided that she wanted to one day cross the Atlantic by herself.
And let's remember, a lot of people died trying to fly, didn't they?
Well, actually, what's very interesting is after Lindbergh went across, there were 7 women that tried to be the first woman across. Some of them were actually pilots. Some of them were women that were paying to be passengers. It was just as dangerous to be a passenger. But one of the things you asked me before is how did she meet George Palmer Putnam? And this is where it gets really juicy. This is the stuff that is not in your Scholastic Kids book about Amelia Earhart. George Palmer Putnam was a married man. He was married to the Crayola crayon heiress. I love saying that. Dorothy Binney Putnam. And he had 2 kids, and he was besotted with his new project. So this whole relationship begins as an affair. Eventually it becomes a marriage, but she is George Putnam's mistress at the very beginning of my story. And my story really does begin in New York City. A lot of people think of Amelia Earhart. She was born in Atchison, Kansas, but this whole reality show component is dreamed up in Midtown Manhattan. It is a story in the late 1920s in the beginning. Later on, the world will change just as we've seen our world change, and it becomes a story of the Great Depression and survival, and how are we gonna pay the bills?
I was flabbergasted, not to mention upset, to read about how George Putnam risked the lives of children.
Absolutely. This is very important. I wanted to put in many ways, this is narrative nonfiction. If anyone is a good fan of David Grann or Patrick Radden Keefe, book was excerpted in the New Yorker to my great delight. That was the first time that happened to me to be in print. I've had online stories, but that's the kind of target audience. But it is narrative nonfiction, but it could also be called a double biography. A lot of people don't realize that the Amelia Earhart that we know, she was a real person. She did know how to fly before she met George Putnam, but the Amelia Earhart that was the influencer, was a creation of a couple, a married couple that were basically trying to survive, the Great Depression. Although in the very beginning, there was a lot of money to be made at the end of the Jazz Age, and he was her manager. Even as her husband, he took 10% of everything that she made. But
The kids, yeah.
the kids were young boys. He started with his own son, and decided he was gonna say that these are books by boys, for boys. Of course, most of these books were ghostwritten, um, but he would then send boys on very dangerous adventures. One Some of them died. There were 5 kids that were walking from South America to New York to be greeted by Jimmy Walker, and only one of them made it. 3 of them died. I wanted to show this because I wanted to show from the very get-go that Amelia Earhart and George Putnam both took very, scary risks that is, going to catch up with you, at a certain point. If you start to believe your own press, that nothing's gonna happen, that you're untouchable, that's like an Evel Knievel mentality. That's gonna
Mhm.
catch up with you eventually, and that's what part of my book is about. But at the very beginning, Amelia Earhart, when she's a passenger on that 1928 flight, it's being flown by a man named Wilmer Stoltz. He's an alcoholic. They're throwing bottles of alcohol out the window as they're getting ready to leave Newfoundland. And George Putnam has put this young woman on that flight, and she's going on that flight willingly. So from 1928, from the moment they meet, these are 2 people that take incredible risks. And, I actually really like Amelia Earhart. I think she's very brave. I think she's, very ambitious, which women are not always allowed to be ambitious in books. In my book, she's shrewd as well. But at the same time, she's taking some unnecessary risks from the get-go. And Putnam as well, as you could see with these kids. Now, when Amelia Earhart becomes connected to Putnam, eventually there are girl explorers. And now, obviously, Amelia Earhart was born in 1897. We know she disappeared in 1937. Many people that knew her are no longer alive, but the children of those kid explorers are still alive. And I was able to interview all of them, and they would talk about how their parents had no agency. The kids' lives would be signed over by parents wanting money during the Great Depression, And they say, "Sure, just send my kid," and, the books will get ghostwritten, and that's kind of really interesting. It's amazing that there are still people that you can, find as new sources if you're interested in archives and interested in turning over every page and finding what hasn't been said before. And I think I'm bringing the story of these forgotten kid explorers
Yeah.
back to life. They were adult bestsellers. These were not kids' books. They were kids' books, but they were the number 4 book on the bestseller list. It was a book about 3 boys going to Africa, ostensibly written by them, but they were like shooting lions in Africa, and they sold a lot of copies.
I mean, we have some
Yes,
questions coming
first,
in.
we have some questions, but first a comment from Karen Smith. She says, "I have her autograph from when my dad, as a lad, saw her fly at an air show. How wonderful."
How that's actually quite valuable too. Hold on to that. Bring that to Antiques Roadshow if you want.
Yes, and especially now with your book bringing new publicity. S.R. O'Brien, who is listening to your audiobook, says, after divorcing Putnam, why did Dorothy Binney continue to fund Earhart and Putnam's adventures?
Well, there's a whole complicated story there. Now, first of all, she had all the money in the world. The Putnam family was the publishing company, but they didn't have a lot of money. The Crayola Crayon family was the real money, and she did not want to. She moved to Florida. She wanted her children to live in a respectable home, and Amelia Earhart moves into the mansion in Rye, which I've been in. I've been in there for a few hours and looked around. It's lovely. But she was a social worker before she moved in. And then all of a sudden she's living in a giant mansion. So in the very beginning, Putnam was able to bring her minks and get her cars. But during the Great Depression, they were house rich, cash poor, if that makes any sense. At
Mhm.
least for all intents and purposes, they wanted to show that they were living in a good place. It was important for Amelia Earhart to look like she had made it, um, and also, to be really honest with you, there was a little blackmail going on. I mean, one of the things you find about out in my book is that you don't always want to work with the estate, because when you're working with an estate, they erase some of the uglier details. But Putnam could be quite cruel. He was threatening to blackmail his wife over, other she was having her own affair in the Jazz Age, anything goes in the 1920s. I mean, it's a really complicated story. I always say to people, history is not clean, but one thing that you can really get from Dorothy, and some of the sources on this is her own, diary, which she kept, and there's also audio tapes that are now available that I was one of the first biographers to listen to that are at the Smithsonian, where basically she is afraid of him. If somebody is ver can be he was very vengeful, he was very good to Amelia Earhart because she was providing part of their income. She was lecturing, she would do a stunt, she would lecture, and he would make money off of that. But he was very cruel to other women that were her competitors that he was perceiving as a threat. This is not a whitewashed narrative, and anyone who's listening to this, I love Amelia Earhart, and I've listened to hundreds of hours of new archives, audio tape of people that knew everyone, and no one says anything bad about Amelia Earhart. But I also can say that nobody says anything good about George Putnam. But that's what makes it so interesting to me. Like, that is she knew who she was marrying,
Yeah.
and
Well,
that's interesting. It makes her more ambitious to me.
um, and I have to ask you, um, tell us about that last flight. How big
Yes.
a deal was it?
Well, this flight, 1932 flight, she does really to push women forward. She wants to show that she could do it, that women can fly across the Atlantic. She is the second person to cross the Atlantic, male or female. It's a big deal. She doesn't go to Paris like Lindbergh. She lands in a cow field, but in Ireland, but she's still the number 2 person. But that 1937 flight, the Great Depression is really roaring on, and they have no money. I mean, Putnam was I found records at the Explorers Club. He had to retire as vice president because he couldn't afford the dues at that point. This is everyone thought he was a great millionaire. So what that last flight was the gimmick was she was going to be the first to fly around the equator. It's not one flight, it's a series of flights that were going to be close to the equator as possible. She was not flying alone. She had a navigator named Fred Noonan, who this was the second time she was trying to fly around. The first time there was a ground looping, which is a wheel spinning out, and that trip was canceled. She was on that flight with a navigator who knew Morse code, but Amelia Earhart never bothered on the redo to learn Morse code. And Fred Noonan, who was a very good navigator, was also an alcoholic. A lot of alcoholism is a very big part of this story from her own father, which is the reason that she was in 7 schools, to that very last flight. He came cheaply because he was from Pan Am. He helped open up the world flights, but he was fired for alcoholism, and he did not learn Morse code. And there was lots of mistakes, a lot of cost cutting. She was always lecturing. She was not getting her skills up. And again, she's super brave, but she is flying above what she is being promoted as her level of skill. And this corner's cut. And I would say, and you could see it in the excerpt that was in the New Yorker, that was the part of the book that they excerpted, that this was in many ways a tragedy foretold. This is not something that is mysterious. Later on, there's all sorts of mishigas, and we get stories that she was taken by the Japanese, which is not true. There was a lot of war propaganda that helped push that along. George Putnam got remarried and was broke and was even slipping people propaganda himself to help fund a movie called Flight for Freedom, which starred Rosalind Russell. And then there was a cottage industry of men starting around 1960, saying that she was taken by Japan. Some people, there was even a book in 1972 that she came back and was a housewife in New Jersey. And, we can just say this is nonsense.
There
There's
was a picture a few years ago, right?
absolutely on a dock. And she was supposed to be with Fred Noonan and captive. And somebody found, of course, that Amelia Earhart that was definitely ran out of fuel, but that that photo was 3 years old from the time that it was published. It was in Japan in 1934, and she disappeared in 1937. So that's the kind of nonsense that we see. The nonsense continues, Scott. I have to say, people can still make money off of Amelia Earhart's name and false stories, but the actual record that we have in the government, and now the Smithsonian has all these tapes called the Amelia Earhart Project. So anyone listening today, the government is still shut down, but the Smithsonian website is up, and you can listen to the people talking. The last man that spoke to Amelia Earhart is on tape from 1971, and he said she was frantic and out of fuel, and that matches the records that we have from the Coast Guard. So if anyone is trying to sell you that she ran out of fuel and then landed in a lagoon 400 miles away, which is what's in the news again, it's just kind of disturbing. There's no one in the family on either the Putnams or the Earharts. The descendants of her sister are the descendants on the Earhart side. Nobody believes anything other than she ran out of fuel near Howland Island. The other thing is mystery also drives tourism. So even in Atchison, Kansas, they know that she ran out of fuel, but that's not going to get people to the town. So they have a festival called the Amelia Earhart Festival that has 50,000 people. Mystery sells tickets. And but what I'm trying to say in my book is that the mystery of Amelia Earhart is not how she died. The mystery of Amelia Earhart is how she lived. Who was she? Because I don't think we know who she is. We know an iconic version of her. And what I was trying to do in my book was to show who she was as a real nuanced person. And she had flaws too. And she was sexual, which people get wrong. A lot of things, including her sexuality. All of that. There were people who had relationships with her that were talking on tape. And I was able to work over 5 years to go to archives that no one had ever looked at. that's the advantage of having a mainstream book with a place like Viking with Penguin. You get a good advance. And I, much to my husband's chagrin, I used it to actually go to the places all over. I went to 30 different cities and looked at everything. I'm a big Robert Caro fan and turn every page and I just making sure I got everything. And then I got lucky a couple of times and got archives that my jaw was dropping. And I take delight in telling truth. And I hope that I know that the people that listen to you love truth as well. And that's what this story is. It's like it's an unvarnished story, but it's also she's not a secret Nazi like Charles Lindbergh. I mean, like, like the worst thing like she's shaving years off of how old she is. She might be playing a good cop, bad cop now and then when her husband is being her bully to get her get her in the limelight. But she's not a terrible person. And I want to say one other thing is that she's very helpful to other women. She's the first president of the 99s, which is an organization of women pilots that originally in 1929, it was the 99 women pilots. They're still going strong. And she's also, when the whole bottom dropped out on aviation after the Great Depression, she becomes the ambassador to the air and encourages women to take flights. And she almost single-handedly saves the aviation industry. So when you take a plane ride today, that's in good part due to Amelia Earhart. Do we have to put all this other false stuff? I'm going to break some hearts, but all of her books are ghostwritten. The fashion line is ghostwritten. The story about her, she did go up in the air with Eleanor Roosevelt over the White House, but it wasn't spontaneous. That was something that Putnam planned. I mean, but we can handle that. We're grown-ups. And, we see so many lies today. If we can't handle the truth about Amelia Earhart, how are we going to handle the rest of the world? I mean, this is not terrible history, but history is not clean. And Amelia Earhart wasn't the greatest pilot of her time. As a woman, there were other great pilots, but they didn't have George Putnam. And that's crazy thing, Scott, is that we wouldn't have women going to the moon, which we do. We're going back to the moon with women astronauts. The hero was Amelia Earhart. She wasn't going to influence any of the millions of people that she influenced without George Putnam, who wasn't the nicest guy, but it was together that they created this iconic person that has influenced so many millions of people.
No, I was just going to make a comment. It was, which I hadn't understood before reading your book, that one of the disadvantages she had is that she had to pay for her flight lessons. Men were being trained because of the
right, and because men had many hours and hours at World War I. She did learn how to fly in California in the early 20s, but there was no real path for women to continue in aviation. Nobody was hiring them as pilots. They could maybe do a few stunts that were very dangerous. But what she did hit upon was social work. And if you know Frances Perkins, who was a social worker, who was first, right? It was in FDR's cabinet. That was one of her role models, too. And when George Putnam basically finds out that there's a flying social worker in Boston, talk about is getting the reality show checkbox, like that sounds, she's as wholesome. She's a social worker. She's a good looking woman. And that was what she was doing. And I think that she would have probably risen as a social worker. She was already getting on the board in Boston. She could fly. So that was a gimmick that she had locally, but she was not going to be internationally famous. She was definitely not headed in that direction. If she had lived after 1937, I think she would have been in the space industry. I think she would have really pushed women to go into space.
Look, I can't say enough about the book and about our conversation. The Aviator and the Showman, Laurie Gwen Shapiro. Am I displaying it correctly? I did find myself reading about George Putnam saying, I hope our daughters never meet anyone like George.
He was charming, though. I think if he was a love bomber, as we say in 2025.
I don't believe I know that phrase. I do now. I am going to spring it on our daughters, as a matter of fact. So, Laurie Gwen Shapiro, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me as a guest. I'm so honored and delighted.
And thanks everybody for joining us in our open book. We have Deborah Tannen tomorrow, right? Do we have her book nearby that I can have?
Yes, we do. It's right here.
All right. By all means, Finding My Father, Deborah Tannen. Much nicer guy than George Putnam. So, Laurie, thanks
Take
very much
care.
with us. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.